This is part 6 of the series. Joseph Blainstar Vaji, September 10, 1987. He was on death row for the murder of John Denson, a 43-year-old juvenile probation officer. John Denson and his family sat down to watch television on the evening of November 19, 1976. Three men barged into their house and disturbed them. Denson, a Montgomery County juvenile probation officer, had a $6,000 weapons collection that the intruders were pursuing. There was a struggle and a gunshot. Joseph Blainstar Vaji, a 34-year-old cement worker, was the triggerman. Denson fought and begged to be saved. Then, in an effort to keep him from suffering, Sarvaji shot Denson twice more. Denson's wife and daughter, Grace and Susan, were restrained hand to foot and kept under a blanket during this time. Through a little hole in the blanket, 13-year-old Susan Denson was able to see the killing of her father. According to her later testimony, one of the robbers said, kill him," while her father pleaded for mercy. She recognized the men by their voices throughout the trial. Sarvaji was told to shoot Denson's wife and daughter by the other two perpetrators, Glenn Earl Martin and G.W. Green, but he refused. He said that the only things he shot were pigs. After expressing regret to Denson's wife and daughter and declining to murder them, Sarvaji grabbed ammunition from the gun cabinet and departed. Sarvaji was found guilty of John Denson's murder and given the death penalty. The United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit in New Orleans and federal judge Lynn Hughes of Houston rejected the last-minute appeal. Sarvaji had a lengthy history of property-related offenses and was on probation for a burglary at the time of the murder. Additionally, he was discharged from the service for bad behavior. He said that a psychiatrist's test indicated he was unlikely to commit murder again and that his prior convictions had been for nonviolent crimes. The court believed that Sarvaji was a menace to society because of the evidence that had been posted against him. After 10 years on death row, Sarvaji was strapped to a gurney and given a lethal injection on the morning of September 10, 1987. He refused his last 2 meals and had no final statement. He was pronounced dead at 12:30 a.m. Robert Streetman, January 7, 1988. He was on death row for the murder of Christine Baker, 44 years old. On December 17, 1982, Christine Baker was shot and killed during a break-in at her house. Law enforcement officers detained Robert Streetman, Johnny Johnson, David Kirkendall, and Gary Holden 2 days later, on December 19, 1982, in relation to a string of agricultural equipment thefts. Officials found out that the 4 robbery suspects had also been engaged in the Baker murder while questioning them. Streetman made admissions and signed a written confession later that night and early the next morning, naming himself as Baker's murderer. In their statements, Holden and Kirkendall also described their roles in the murder and named Streetman as the triggerman. Each of the 4 guys was charged with capital murder. However, only Streetman was ultimately found guilty of capital murder after the trial. Holden was placed on probation for 10 years in return for his testimony during Streetman's trial. Kirkendall was sentenced to 45 years in the Texas Department of Corrections in exchange for a plea deal and his testimony. Johnson was given immunity by the authorities, and although Kirkendall's statement was delivered to the jury by the state, neither Johnson nor Kirkendall personally testified during Streetman's trial. Streetman was first represented by Michael McNeely, who was assigned by the state trial judge. McNeely had never tried a case involving the death penalty and lacked experience in managing contentious criminal matters. Due to his inexperience, McNeely asked the trial court to assign an experienced lawyer to help him with the case's preparation and trial. Robert Coe was appointed by the trial judge at McNeely's request and ultimately acted as the de facto lead counsel during the trial. Only 4 witnesses were called by the state during Streetman's trial at the guilt stage: Gary Holden, the victim's husband Niall Henry Baker, Streetman's acquaintance Clint Parr, and Ralph Osborne, the chief deputy sheriff of Hardin County, Texas. Deputy Sheriff Ralph Osborne, the state's first witness, gave a direct examination of his testimony on his investigation into the murder of Christine Baker. Osborne's testimony was centered on locating Baker's body and concluding that she had been murdered based on the physical evidence found at the location. Deputy Osborne was asked to testify under cross-examination by defense lawyer Robert Coe, who pointed out that Streetman, Holden, and Kirkendall had all written statements acknowledging their involvement in the Baker murder and providing consistent versions of it. The execution was halted for over an hour by the Attorney General's office to determine whether a second appeal had been filed 2 minutes after Streetman was taken to the death chamber and strapped to a gurney, but before needles could be placed. About 10 minutes after the Supreme Court ruling, Streetman's lawyer, Robert McGlasson, called him, according to Assistant Attorney General Bob Walt, and said that he would be filing a second appeal. At 3:19 a.m., the interim hold was removed, and the deadly medications were given. However, the phone rang in the death chamber 7 minutes before Streetman was pronounced dead. The telephone call was made by the governor's office, and they basically wanted to know, since there was a delay, how much of the procedures have been already completed. The response was that they already began the process. At that point in time, nothing could be done anymore. Attorney McGlasson was in the process of filing a written stay when he was informed that his client was already dead. Streetman was 25 years old at the time of his execution. He had no final words, and there are no records of his final meal. Donald Gene Franklin, November 3, 1988. He was on death row for the abduction and murder of Mary Margaret Moran, a nurse. She was taken by Franklin just after midnight on July 26, 1975. She was stabbed 7 times and transported to an overgrown field a few miles away from the hospital. On the afternoon of July 30, she was found still alive and naked. A little distance from where she was discovered, a number of her personal belongings were also found, including her nurse's uniform and shoes, sweater, and panties. The same morning she was found, she passed away. Franklin was identified as the killer and sentenced to death. Before receiving a lethal injection at the wall unit of the Texas Department of Corrections, he did not make a final statement. As the effects of the drugs pouring through needles implanted into his arms took effect, Franklin coughed multiple times while staring at the ceiling of the death chamber. At 12:30 a.m., 6 minutes after the physicians started giving him the injection, he was declared dead. He ate only the meat patties from the hamburgers he had requested as a final meal. Raymond Landry Sr., December 13, 1988. For the shooting death of Cosmos Pritis, 33, at a dairy-maid business he owned in Houston on August 6, 1982, Landry was sentenced to death. As he and his family were getting ready to close the restaurant, Pritis, a Greek immigrant, was shot in the head and robbed of over $2,000. 5 prior execution dates of Landry's had been stayed. His final execution was stopped for around 14 minutes when a needle placed in the condemned killer's arm caused an intravenous tube containing a lethal mixture of poison to burst free. About 2 minutes after the execution started, a jet of liquid poured out of the IV tubing that was placed close to the inside of Landry's right elbow. Minutes after the tube was reinserted, Landry passed away, looking at his arm for a moment before returning his gaze to the ceiling of the death chamber. As soon as the tube came out, Warden Jack Pursley asked for a guard to draw a white curtain, obscuring Landry from onlookers' eyes. From behind the white barrier came a low groan, thought to be Landry's. When the curtain was reopened at 12:37 a.m., approximately 14 minutes later, Landry was motionless and did not seem to be breathing. Landry refused the offer of a final meal and gave no final words. Please hit that subscribe button if you like my channel. See you next time. Bye bye.